Welcome. I'm Jean Lightner, and today I'd like to talk to you about the power of a paradigm in science. This is a fact. Would you like to interpret it for me? If I give you this as the context, you can easily interpret it as the number 13. But what if I give you this as the context? Now it's no longer a number at all, it's the letter B. So while this is a fact, facts never speak for themselves. They have to be interpreted, and that's critically important to remember. Speaking of interpreting facts, the famous evolutionist Ernst Mayr once wrote, "Evolutionary biology, in contrast with physics and chemistry, is a historical science. The evolutionist attempts to explain events and processes that have already taken place. Laws and experiments are inappropriate techniques for the explication of such events and processes. Instead, one constructs a historical narrative consisting of a tentative reconstruction of the particular scenario that led to the events one is trying to explain." Now that may sound like a mouthful, but I want you to pay attention to this right here. The evolutionist constructs a historical narrative. In other words, makes up a story. Now, that may not sound too scientific to you, but when you're dealing with origins, unless you have somebody that recorded it and gave you the information, you're pretty much stuck with making up a story. So the context for understanding the world around us is called a paradigm, and our paradigm determines how we interpret the evidence and the historical narratives we might choose to use or might choose not to use. Our paradigm affects what we see, and this involves bias. Our paradigm gives us a bias. It is good to be able to see things in more than one paradigm. That can help us to mitigate some of our bias. And contradictory data is very important. As a scientist in the field of biology, I am drawn to data that seems contradictory because I want to understand what's going on. Today we'll look at two origins paradigms. The first is the evolution paradigm, which includes the concept of universal common descent. And the second is the creation paradigm, and I'll introduce the concept of created kinds. So let's put them side by side, and let's see what their similarities and differences are. The creation paradigm has life forms being created, and a creator. Seems simple enough. The evolutionary paradigm has life forms that just arose. An important thing to remember is a designer is excluded. That's the way the story has been made up. The story was made up to reject the ideas of a creator as found in the Bible. So it's very strange when a Christian would want to fully embrace evolution when the story was made up to contradict the Bible. Both views accept that organisms can change, and this is called by biologists evolution. I see this in my background in agriculture and in veterinary medicine, because in hundreds of years we have hundreds of dog breeds, and in thousands of years we have thousands of breeds of cattle, and many of them are very locally adapted. And so you see that a lot of change has arisen. We've been able to observe it, so no one disputes that. And of course the evolutionists call that evolution. So it's kind of ironic. But there is a difference. In the creation view, there is limited common descent, and that comes from the Bible, where we learn that God created plants and animals according to their kinds. So today, if I go out and I look for rabbits and hares, I can find hares in the Arctic and hares in the desert and hares all over the world. And if you want to propose to me that all these hares are related by common descent, I'll agree, yeah, they probably are because of their similarities. Also, you could look for foxes, and you can find foxes in the Arctic and foxes in the desert and foxes all over the world. And if you want to argue that all foxes are related by common descent, I would agree. In fact, I'd say that the coyotes and the dogs and wolves are probably related to them as well. The whole family of Canidae, I would say, are probably related by common descent. However, if you want to propose that those rabbits and those canids are related by common descent, I'm not likely to buy that story. I'm aware of a lot of differences in skeletal anatomy, in the teeth, in digestive anatomy. I'm not buying that. But universal common descent is an important part of the evolutionary view. Now, universal common descent has some serious problems. Some are related to morphology or physical appearance. There's profound gaps between groups at higher levels, and this was described by Erich Wasmann. You notice he was born the year The Origin of Species was published. He was an excellent field biologist. He studied insects, and he was writing about this in his day, and he said, all honest supporters of the theory of evolution who pay due attention to the facts acknowledge further that the grounds for assuming the existence of a real relationship between the forms in question become more scanty when the higher divisions are considered. For the species of one genus, these grounds often amount to great and even irrefutable probability, and the same may be said in not a few cases of the genera in one family, and occasionally for the families in one order, but it can seldom be maintained for the orders in one class. The evidence afforded by natural science for the theory of common descent becomes steadily weaker the higher we ascend the system. I want you to notice a couple things. He talks here about the theory of evolution, and he contrasts this in this book with the theory of permanence or species fixity. He rejects species fixity and embraces the idea that organisms can change, as I would too. But notice he draws a line here. The theory of common descent or universal common descent, he's rejecting. Why? Well, the science doesn't support it. Now, one could argue that the intermediates died out, and in fact, Wallace, who was also a contemporary of Wasmann and Darwin, argued this. Oh, the intermediates just died out, and that's why we don't see them today. But this is not evident in the fossil record, and Stephen Jay Gould was a famous evolutionist that in his writing pointed that out. Well, let's take a look at the fossil record. This is a depiction of what appears in the fossil record, and at the lower levels, these are vertebrates. At the lower levels, you don't see much. And things show up, and then sometimes there's more of them as time goes on, and a couple of them disappear, and some get greater. So that's what's in the fossil record. This is what the picture looks like in a vertebrate evolution book. And you will notice the dashed lines. The dashed lines, that's inference, okay? That tells you the paradigm that the authors are using. They're using the evolutionary universal common descent paradigm. And those dashed lines are where they believe connections might be, but they have no data to support it. One could just have easily drawn the dashed lines this way. Do you see how big a difference it makes, according to the paradigm you're using? Well, what about molecular evidence? We often hear DNA and proteins, oh, they really support evolution. Well, profound gaps are also seen here, again at the higher levels. In fact, Wolff and Kunin have had to hypothesize that there were dramatic bursts of increasing complexity in the past, followed by slower gene loss. And this is to explain the difference, for example, between insect orders. The Hymenoptera are very similar to each other, and the Diptera are very similar to each other, but the proteins produced by those two orders of insects are very different. So you would have had to have dramatic bursts of increasing complexity, and we don't see this, followed by slower gene loss. Well, that we see. Here is some research done by the Creation Research Society, our eKinds project, and I was involved with this. This is, you see on the left, a heat map that was published in a 2019 issue of the Quarterly, and the cover is up on the upper right. But this heat map helps us see the comparison of proteins produced by different species. Now, every species listed down the right side is also listed across the bottom. And down here at the bottom, we have the frog. Okay, this frog, you can see over here on the lower left, when it's compared to itself, we get a nice light yellow color. Now, the frog was the only amphibian in this one, and so if you go across the bottom, you see a darker colors and darker reddish colors where it's compared to other animals in this group, and that's because there's greater differences. So as we continue to look from the lower left to the upper right, you should be able to see very light yellow squares where things are compared to themselves, and there's very high similarity. We also kind of see groups or boxes that are fairly yellow. So here we have birds, and there were two kinds of birds. There's landfowl and waterfowl, and there's a little bit of darkness in that box suggesting that maybe there are more than one group, but birds are kind of similar to each other. And the next group we have is humans. You will notice that humans, which includes the Denisova and the Neanderthal, humans produce human proteins, and it's very distinctive. And if you travel horizontally to the left or to the right of that box, you see that there's quite a bit of difference between the human proteins and those of the other groups. This rather large box here includes the Old World monkeys, the great apes, and New World monkeys. And up here we have the rat and the mouse. They kind of form a group. And above that we have cats. Now, my whole life, I've been taught that great apes are the most similar to humans, and the chimpanzee is our closest relative, and we're so similar it's absolutely amazing. But if we compare the proteins, that's not the case at all. In fact, the great apes, which includes the chimpanzee, are found in this little box outlined in a dashed red. They are not similar to humans. They are similar to monkeys. There's other lines of evidence that have been published in the literature, and in the description I'll list the references. There was a study that found 584 human genes not present in other primates, and 60 of these were so unique they were believed to be de novo, which means you can't just duplicate a gene or switch things around. I mean, they seem to come from nowhere. Another study talked about 2,649 non-coding regions that are very distinct in humans. Now, these are non-coding regions, so they were not picked up in our study. And these are called human accelerated regions. They've been very hard to explain reasonably within an evolutionary paradigm. Another study found 510 regulatory regions not in humans but present in other mammals. Again, this is a regulatory region, so we didn't even pick this up in our study. The separate creation of humans is a robust hypothesis, even if one only looks at the scientific evidence. Well, there are predictions that both models make, and I'd like to compare some of the predictions. Some of the predictions have to do with the overall trend of the change. We discussed both models or paradigms accept change. They accept evolution in the sense of change. What types? Well, in the creation model, you'd expect adaptive change, and this is because God created living creatures according to their kinds and told them to reproduce and fill the earth. And again, after the flood, they were to reproduce and fill the earth. So if that's what they were to do, he obviously gave them the ability to do that because he intends the earth to be inhabited, and that's mentioned in Isaiah. So adaptive change makes sense within the creation model. But there's another type of change we need to consider, and that's degenerative change. According to Genesis chapter 3, humans sinned, and because of that sin, death and suffering entered the world. So we would expect changes that reflect that, the death and the suffering and things like that. Now, the overall trend in the evolution paradigm needs to be upward. This is because one has to account for all the complexity in living things, and you have to account for the differences in proteins. So you have to have those enormous bursts of complexity. The problem is we do not observe that. We don't. Here is a reprint of an article that appeared in the Creation Research Society Quarterly, and it asks, is bacterial resistance to antibiotics an appropriate example of evolutionary change? If all you mean is change, then it's definitely an example of change. But does it build complexity as required by the evolutionary paradigm? Well, in fact, it doesn't. You find that the mutations that lead to resistance involve loss of things. For example, the first one there, the phenotype providing resistance is a loss of enzyme activity. For the second antibiotic, ampicillin, it involves an SOS response halting cell division. For the third one, there's loss of a regulatory protein. For chloramphenicol, there's reduced formation of a porin or regulatory protein. And so it goes down the list. Now, antibiotic resistance is good for the bacteria. It allows them to survive. But it's not good for us, of course. But the phenotype that provides the resistance is loss and degeneration. And we find these types of examples all over the place. Observed changes and the mutations that underlie them alter biochemical pathways. But you had to have a biochemical pathway there to begin with that can be altered. So it requires pre-existing complexity. It also requires a redundancy to avoid killing the organism. And I would like to talk a little bit about this. In good design, you have redundancy. And that's a hallmark of well-thought-out design. I have a son who's a pilot, and we've discussed redundancy in the design of aircraft. If you were thousands of feet in the air and a system failed, you could have a bunch of dead people with a crash. And that's not acceptable. So in the airline industry, the planes are designed with redundancy, so if there's failure in a system, something else can take over and the people don't die. And you have that also within living organisms as well. The problem within the evolutionary paradigm is there's no way to get that. You cannot design redundancy by chance mutations because natural selection can't even choose for it because by definition redundancy is not needed in the moment, it's there for the future. The pattern of changes observed calls into question the idea that mutations are random or accidental. And James Shapiro is not a creationist, but he has recognized this. And he talks about things like bacteria being sentient, being able to think and make changes so they can survive, genetic changes so they can survive. And even when we find beneficial changes, they're heading in the wrong direction. They require that complexity, they don't build it. They erode the complexity, they don't build it. So the mechanisms for change are a little bit different between the two models as well. If God designed creatures to be able to adapt, then the systems in them are designed for change. That means there are options by which they can change and probably designed mechanisms for making the changes. And it's interesting that Shapiro's work points to mechanisms that fit the creation paradigm. In contrast, evolution just has accidental chance changes in DNA, because remember, their story was designed to get rid of a creator. And natural selection is the only thing you have that can try to preserve these changes that supposedly magically bring about complexity. So when it comes to origins, it deals with history. The evolutionists construct a historical narrative. They have a story. But the Bible already has one. How does one reconstruct events from the past? Well, ideally, it's best reconstructed from eyewitness testimony. Interesting, the Bible gives that as a way to reconstruct events, the eyewitness testimony. And in forensics, that's very important. You can do all this lab analysis. You can find DNA that says this person was at this place at this time, but you can't tell what the person was doing. You need an eyewitness. Well, isn't using the Bible biased? Well, it's interesting. It's only biased if it isn't true. Because according to the Bible, a God who is eternal, who can be everywhere at once and knows everything, is the one that inspired the Bible. That's where we got it from. And if one is eternal and knows everything and can be everywhere at once, you remove bias. So if the Bible's true, it's my most powerful tool to remove bias. And refusing to consider it, as the evolutionists do, is definitely biased. And it's come up with a story that really, quite honestly, doesn't fit reality. That's why I am thrilled as a scientist to be able to work with the Creation Research Society. Research is our middle name. We've been around for nearly 60 years. We have an iDino project, which looks at soft tissue in dinosaur bones. And this is a serious problem for evolutionists because it means that the dinosaurs cannot be as old as they say. And I am involved with the eKinds project, and we looked at mechanisms for adaptation, among other things. So if you want to be where the real science is, this is where it's at. Thank you so much for your attention.